A very good evening and thank you so much for joining us on the weekend edition. My name is Nora Osende and this weekend we are going to talk about human trafficking. Well, earlier on in the week there was a day that was marked. This was the day for anti-trafficking. It was the World Global Day against trafficking of humans. Now, this year's theme was Leave No Child Behind in the fight against human trafficking. We did a story about that earlier on in the week, and we had an interview with an expert in regards to human rights. And I'm glad today in studio with me, I have the very expert, and that's none other than Dr. Livingstone Sewanyana, the Executive Director and the founder of the Human Rights Foundation for Human Rights Initiative. Thank you so much, Doctor, for making time.
Pleasure. Good evening, Nora, and our viewers.
Yes, it's good to have you in studio. As we went about the week, we discussed about human trafficking, especially among children. And some of the issues that you highlighted are some of the things that you still want to expand a little bit more. One of the things that you talked about is the style in which child trafficking manifests in Uganda. Kindly expound more. Let's start on that again.
Child trafficking is not very well known to ordinary people, though one would argue that it's actually a common practice in the sense that children are increasingly brought to urban areas from rural areas to work, sometimes as housemates. Now, that phenomenon may not be known as trafficking, but it is some form of trafficking. Indeed, those who bring them to the urban centers for work may not know or may not be conversant with some of the legal restrictions. For example, that children under 16 are not actually supposed to work under our constitution. The right to labor is not one of those they should be engaging in at that age. Neither are they aware that by depriving them of their rights to stay in their household back home, they're actually engaging in some form of trafficking. So often those people who engage in trafficking of children are in business. They are actually doing business. They have identified families in town which need some form of labor and are in touch with rural areas, and there their children, for one reason or the other, maybe because the households cannot afford to pay for school fees or take care of their children, they are willing to part with their children to come to town. And in so doing, the children get exploited. Right. Once they get to the urban centers, they are placed within homes, sometimes homes which do not respect the rights of children. They subject them to excessive work. They don't pay them. There is no wage earmarked for them. And even there are homes where these children are not even allowed to eat. They get neglected. That form of abuse is not one that is known commonly. But at the end of the day, these children are being exploited, being subjected to abuse, and that is a form of child trafficking. Right. The other form of child trafficking, of course, which most people know, is where you take a child in search of employment to another country. For example, a child from the Philippines being taken to the Middle East. Now that child faces some serious mistreatment at times. The child gets deprived, cannot have access to his or her family. But there are also cases where children have been subjected to sexual exploitation. For example, I'm aware that in the Philippines, children are taken to naval bases, U.S. military naval bases, and are subjected to some form of sexual exploitation. That's also another form of child trafficking. So it manifests itself in different ways. But at the end of the day, what is important is that children under such circumstances are being exploited and being mistreated.
Right. So mostly in Uganda, the commonest form of child trafficking is the one that we see children being ferried from rural areas to urban areas, mainly in households actually, to work as, for example, maids and laborers in these very depriving situations. So that also leads us to understand that poverty could be one of the causes of child trafficking, especially here in Uganda. What else do you think actually are the main contributors of child trafficking, specifically in this aspect?
As you have rightly observed, poverty is the leading contributor to this issue of child trafficking. Because on one hand, you are dealing with a family which cannot afford. It's poverty-stricken, cannot afford the basics, or cannot guarantee an adequate standard of living for the child, and would prefer that that child, for one reason or the other, is exposed to some form of labor, which of course is unacceptable. So because they are poor, they are willing and ready to part with their children in search of work. So that is one reason why in most cases the poor who are most likely to part with their children and have them ferried to urban areas in search of employment. If you talk about children, for example, in sugar plantations or tea plantations who are young and exposed to some form of child labor, again, poverty becomes an evident contributor, because still it is those families which cannot afford, which will part with their children to go and work in sugar plantations, tea plantations, and cannot be even guaranteed some form of protection, as we have seen. So poverty is one of the major leading contributors to child trafficking. A weak legislative framework could also be one of the major considerations, because if there are no frameworks within which they can be protected within the community, then the chances of these people who get involved in child trafficking, who we normally call cartels, are high, because there's no one to, to monitor and check on that vice. So again, a weak legal framework could also be one of the major contributors to this problem. But overall, I would argue that where poverty is apparent and prevalent, then the chances of children being trafficked are very high.
The chances of children being trafficked are very high, not just in Uganda, but also globally. I remember in our earlier discussion, as we're doing the news story, we made a little bit of comparison between the child trafficked in Uganda vis-a-vis the child trafficked abroad, of which you had given us a little glimpse of. Just give us a comparison at the global scale and at the local scale. How does that look like?
I think globally, children are being trafficked to countries where there's hope that they will get into gainful employment. And those countries, mainly are poor countries also, compared to where these children are trafficked. Because, for example, the Middle East is the biggest recipient of such children. But also Europe also is a good recipient, especially when it comes to child prostitution. If you go to Europe, you still find children who are engaged in acts of prostitution. Now, those countries generally look at it as a business. It's some form of business. But the trafficking that we are talking about here in a country like Uganda is not seen in that context. It's largely to do with poor families, parting their children to go and search for some form of employment. And the only employment generally is as housemaids, or in the alternative, working in big plantations like sugarcane plantations or tea plantations. So in terms of the magnitude, I would compare this to be on a small scale in our country and a bigger scale to those countries if we compare those countries where children are massively trafficked either to Europe or the Middle East, either for purposes of providing labor or sometimes as part of the sex industry.
So I would consider the children that are normally on the streets, especially from Karamoja, as, would we categorize them as children that have been trafficked?
They are perceived as such, because again, you could argue that they are leaving their homes, running to the urban centers to earn a living. There must be people behind that sort of practice, bringing them from Karamoja to places like Kampala. So in a sense, they're also being trafficked, because if we understand trafficking, trafficking is where there is lack of consent. Trafficking where it is being done involuntarily or under some degree of deception. There is some degree of deception that when I get to Kampala, I'll earn a decent living, only to be dumped on the streets and again becomes a street problem. So yes, it is some form of trafficking, I would argue, although it's not as organized as the other form of trafficking we were talking about earlier.
Oh, yes. We talked about the comparisons between Uganda and the international way in which children are trafficked. And so I just want to come back home a little bit and just understand what legal framework is there that is actually addressing this issue of child trafficking in Uganda?
We have a very robust legal framework. The only challenge is the implementation. Right. In terms of starting with the Constitution, it makes provision for protection of children's rights. So already from the constitutional perspective, we have already some legal guarantees. We have the Children's Act, which provides for rights of children, and that children should be treated in their best interest. It does provide for that. Even under our criminal law and criminal procedure, the question of criminal liability arises. A child can only be criminally liable at 12 years and above. So there is a framework for that. So when it comes to protection of children, there are also mechanisms. For example, within the police, there's a family and children's desk that is established. Again, when we talk about at the national level, we have the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Affairs, under which we have the Directorate of Labor and Social Welfare. They are all mechanisms to protect children. And besides that, even where children come into conflict with the law has made very clear provision that children cannot be detained or incarcerated with adults. They have to be kept separate from adults, whether at a police station or a prison facility, as long as they are in some form of detainment. They cannot be held together with adults. So the law has made clear provisions for the protection of children, even those who come into conflict with the law. So in that case, what lacks, or sometimes where we experience challenge, is the enforcement of those legal provisions.
So the enforcement is a challenge, but according to your experience, really, as a lawyer who has vast wealth in human rights experience, how effective are the current measures when it comes to protecting children?
To some degree, of course, the mechanisms that are in place provide some sort of recourse in case of such situations. So you could still run to the family and children's desk at the police. You could go to the social and probation welfare office. Such mechanisms do exist. Now, as to their effectiveness, the question sometimes arises in terms, one, of awareness. where the public may not be aware that this act actually constitutes, say, child trafficking, and therefore needs to be reported or needs to be contained. So knowledge sometimes creates a barrier to enforcement, lack of adequate knowledge, but also resources. Some of these mechanisms are not very well resourced. For example, the police may not be well resourced, and as such, even the Office of the Social Welfare and Gender and Probation may not be well resourced. So there's some sort of laxity that arises because of either they are not well resourced in terms of finances or sometimes human capital, and as such they are not able to respond as effectively as possible. I would say generally they do exist, but they need to be reinforced. And a lot of awareness needs to be built within the public to understand that some of these vices occur and they need to be contained and they require collective effort.
Yes. Now that you've mentioned or you've talked about collective efforts, and when it comes to crimes like human trafficking, it's either cut across borders, and how can this be contained in an international way whereby there are inter-governments actually working together to contain the issue of child trafficking?
Whenever we are dealing with a problem of that nature or magnitude, we should always remember that we have to begin within the neighborhood at the local level, where, you know, my neighbor must also be as concerned as myself about the welfare of a particular child. If a child is being mistreated, or for one reason or the other, you are aware that, you know, such a practice is going on, you have also a duty to intervene. So starting with the neighborhoods, with our local authorities, up to the national level becomes important. But the police, I would say, has already mechanisms of containing inter-country, or where, for example, there is crossing of borders. We have what is called Interpol. Interpol within the police, as one of its functions, is to ensure that, you know, we don't have criminality being exported across borders. So those mechanisms do exist, and as such, we just need to be aware that they can be made use of.
Right. When it comes to child trafficking, the first thing that comes into people's head in most cases is basically the girl child. And we all know that, not all of us anyway, but it is clear that it's not all about a girl child, right? There are also the vulnerabilities of a boy child being trafficked. Can you just expand more on the gender there in regards to this?
Speaking about the girl child and the boy child also suffers equally, especially when it comes to forced labor.
Yeah.
I earlier on talked about children being used in plantations. Most of those children who work in sugarcane plantations or tea plantations are boy. They are the boy children. Yeah. So they suffer that form of abuse and exploitation. The girl child, one would argue, is likely to suffer more because it is seen in the perspective of sexual exploitation. And if you are also talking about housemaids, most housemaids are children, and basically those children are the girl child. Not many times do we see boy children, the boy child being brought as a housemaid. It would be mainly the girl child. So in terms of exploitation, they all suffer. They all suffer some form of abuse. But one would say, in terms of the nature of engagement that takes place, the girl child is more exposed than the boy child.
In regards to still the same, what are some of the support services that children that have been trafficked can actually receive locally here, legally?
Speaking about the support mechanisms, I've already alluded to the fact that the police does have a framework within which this can be handled. I've already talked about social welfare and probation as a mechanism, but there are also NGOs NGOs that deal with issues of children and also, family matters. So there are many organizations one can also address their children. I think there is the Uganda Child Rights NGO Network, which brings together many of these child-inclined organizations. So those are our support mechanisms. One can report to that. But even the NGOs, even if they don't deal with children per se, they still would be concerned about a problem of that nature. If it is, for example, a child being mistreated, everyone should be concerned. Even the church, I would imagine that the church also is equally interested in the welfare of children, that whether you go to whichever denomination of faith, they would have a mechanism of responding to the problem of child protection. So it seems to be a more acceptable view that everyone should be concerned about the protection and the plight of children. So the mechanisms do exist. It's just the awareness. Now, going to the communities, we should also be mindful that the LCs, they are also equally supposed to ensure protection of children. Actually, your first point of reference, or point of call, I would say, would be the LC, to report such a transgression against the child to the LC. And beyond the LCs, I would also say then to the police and other important and equally concerned parties.
Okay. How can someone in the community watch out for something that looks like a child that has been trafficked? And how would you advise for the communities to go about these issues that resemble or suspect child trafficking?
It all starts with the family. Family must always be mindful. The community must also be mindful. So how do you reach out? Just be mindful that as a citizen, as also a member of this community, you should also be on the lookout for those who are being mistreated, those who are being harassed, those for one reason or the other are being victimized. And it should be our responsibility to report or to intervene as the case may be. I would imagine that at the lowest level, especially at the LC1, every family should know what to some extent happens elsewhere. But one viewer would also say that sometimes these people live in enclosures, so you cannot even access that. But with time, you also get to know, I would imagine. The media is always out there rallying people to ensure that we are watchful, we are on our guard. So again, they could also bring this information out when it comes to their attention. So I think it is not a closed shop. Right. Society is a very open shop. If one really cares, should be able to find out where the problem does exist.
Right. Yes, yes. And in regards to still the same, do we see the use of technology and social media actually to help to combat these kind of crimes that happen in our societies? We have seen child abuse actually in so many cases where people have gotten footage of a child being mistreated and then, it's circulated. This could also be one of those avenues that actually people could help report such crimes. On top of that, you hinted a bit about sensitization of how it plays a very huge role in combating this. Intertwine that with the use of technology to help in combination of child trafficking.
I think you have rightly pointed out the importance of social media and IT. Social media, by the way, is a double-edged sword. It could, on one hand, help in combating the problem, making us aware of where the problem lies. And I think we have had those cases before, where some housemaids have been seen battering children, and this becomes a national issue. The police comes in, that culprit is arrested and faces justice. But on the other hand, even the cartels can use these to, to reach out to, potential sources of victims, meaning that it's also easy for them to reach out and also to know what measures are being taken against them. So it's a double-edged sword, but it's an important tool in combating the vice. Now, on the question of awareness building, which we call sensitization, I think it's important that everyone knows what is child trafficking, because ideally you find people looking out for mates, using relatives, using friends, using their networks. Are they also aware that if you get this child who is underage, you actually are engaging in some form of criminality or some form of child trafficking by using that underage child as a housemaid? So knowledge is important here, and people need to know that, yes, if I employ an underage child, I am engaging in some form of child trafficking. So it becomes important. There must be programs like this on radio and TV that create that sense of awareness of what exactly child trafficking is, because not many people understand what this is. What are we talking about? To them, they feel like, yes, if I have my money and I have a need for some sort of service to help run my family, and I call upon a relative, a friend, or my social network to get me someone who can help. It doesn't matter whether the child is underage, as long as the child is able to do the job, but not aware, not knowing that actually is engaging in some form of child trafficking. So knowledge of that becomes important. So the police needs to have programs that create awareness among the public about this. And also NGOs should also engage in some form of public awareness. The media should also come out and make it known that when you engage in, for example, taking children to outside the country for some form of engagement, you're actually engaging in some sort of criminal action. Or if you engage children in sexual exploitation, that's some form of abuse. If you engage children as your housemates, that's some form of abuse. If children are employed in your farm, in your plantation, or wherever, be mindful that you are engaging in some form of child abuse. So it should be known, and once it is known, then people are likely to restrain themselves from engaging in that practice. So sensitization becomes critical for as a deterrent measure.
Right. Let's go a bit in regards to children that are in conflict with the law. You earlier on highlighted how it is very, according to the legal framework, these children are supposed to be separated, put in a separate place. How important is that? And just expound a little more on that.
Children sometimes come into conflict with the law. Yeah, right. They get arrested. They are taken to the police station, for example, and while there, they are interrogated. Now, the police must be aware that if they decide to detain these children, they must not detain that child or children with the adults. The idea is that, adults have their vices. Yes, the child could have engaged in affray, but on the other hand, that culprit may not actually have engaged in a minor offense. Maybe a serial killer, might be a habitual offender, and we don't want this child to be to learn bad practices from the other offender. So it's important that they are kept separate, and even when they are due for rehabilitation, their places of rehabilitation are known. Here in Uganda, we have Kampiringisa, we have Naguru Remand Home. That's where they are kept. So they should not be taken to an adult prison like Ruzira or Chitalia or whichever prison it may be. So it's always important to know and to be mindful of these safeguards, such that they don't become victim of exploitation or abuse, as the case may be.
Right. So, Doctor, in your opinion, generally, what is the most urgent action that is needed to help accelerate the progress in regards to human trafficking, specifically child trafficking?
One I would say is awareness building within the public and also within the enforcement agencies. Knowledge is power. People need knowledge to understand the problem and be able to respond and deter the actions that constitute this vice. Secondly, in terms of priority, the institutions that have been set up to deal with some of these issues regarding children need to be strengthened in terms of resources, but also in terms of human capital, and also in terms of goodwill. They need to be appreciated. Quite often, we are not even aware of the existence. How many people are aware of the existence of the family and children's desk at the police? How many people are aware of the social and welfare and probation department within the Ministry of Gender? How many people are aware of their existence? How many people are aware of even the remand homes? Some people are not even aware and have visited them. Someone could even grow up without even knowing that there is a place like Kampiringisa or Naguru. And much as these children may commit crimes, it's also important for us to go and, sensitize them and encourage them to be responsible citizens. So knowledge is important. The institutions need to be strengthened. The legal frameworks also need to be strengthened. But on the other hand, we also need to deal with poverty,
Yes.
because we have said that poverty is the biggest contributor to this problem. We need, again, programs that can empower people economically so that, they don't fall into such challenges. Because why would someone part with his or her child? It's because the person is poor. I saw the other day a woman in Uganda crying out, Now you just imagine what that actually means. The woman who was crying out has 3 children. The only home she had been demolished. There was no alternative provided. And the woman was crying out. Now, how do you expect these children to grow? What is likely to happen? So at one point or the other, it's very likely that this woman will part with her children so that they fend for themselves. And of course, the consequence will be abuse and exploitation. So this is the challenge that we face. We need also to deal with poverty decisively. When we all upgrade to the middle income status, so we upgrade to, middle class, it is very unlikely that there will be homes that will be victims of this abuse, because it's very unlikely that parents or guardians of such children will part with them for those who are involved in this type of business to exploit and abuse them.
Nice. Well, Doctor, you could kindly close by a word of advice in regards to parents and the communities out there and how to protect their children in regards to child trafficking and anything in that regard, legally, socially, whatever. My plea is that
whoever is mindful of the rights of children should do whatever he is in his or her power to protect the child, educate the child, ensure that the child is enabled to grow up like any other child, is not subjected to abuse. Also, it's important to be aware that much as sometimes we have these demands of housemaids, we are impoverished, we should not expose children to such situations. So all in all, what we are saying, it is a collective duty, it's a collective responsibility. It is as important to me as it is important to you. Everyone should be the other's neighbor. We should be watchful and be always on the lookout for, those who are likely to exploit and abuse our children. And at the end of the day, we all deserve, including the children, an environment where we can grow and also enjoy our rights.
Well, thank you so much, Doctor. It has been very insightful, and thank you so much for making time.
It is also a pleasure for me to be on the Catholic television.
Oh, it's nice. Well, we have been discussing the issue of human trafficking, specifically child trafficking right now that is happening in Uganda. And Dr. Livingstone Sewanyana has actually been giving us insights and just giving us more detail, the legal frameworks, elaborating comparisons about human trafficking, specifically child trafficking. Well, one thing for sure is that it is concerted efforts that is needed. Both you and I need to join this fight against child trafficking specifically. It has been nice also having you. I hope to see you next Sunday, same time. My name is Nora Osende. Do have yourself a wonderful evening and a good night.